So, last session, last talk. Maybe you have thought about how to make technology more gender inclusive. Maybe you haven't, then maybe you should, but if you did think about how to make technology more inclusive, then you probably thought that this is difficult for many, many reasons. And one of them is that there's a great danger of actually acting based on stereotypes rather than relevant criteria or dimensions. So we did an empirical study to see if we can have gender inclusiveness personas without promoting gender stereotypes. Did this work with an amazing group of people. Somehow I got the honor to stand up here and talk about it. We got the Oregon State University colleagues. They have been working on gender inclusiveness personas. Maren and I from Heilbronn have been working on stereotyping and personas, and we just decided to join forces trying to figure out whether we can, on one hand, have personas that humanize gender differences, and on the other hand, prevent gender stereotypes. In the talk, I'll first tell you some background about the gender inclusiveness personas, about stereotyping, and then come to our study and what we found out. Maybe first start with personas. They're a tool to help development teams focus on the people that they're developing for. Now, people come in different shapes and forms. People are not all the same. They're different from one another, and they're also different from the people that are developing for them. There is, however, a tendency of people who are developing software to make it for people that are much like them. So this has been called I methodology, or the ego approach, or the design by the eye, or the fundamental design error. So this idea that people try through introspection figure out what do others want. So this, of course, is a problem. So personas are one tool to try and get over this ego approach and help people with that. And if we try to base our knowledge about users on existing research, then there's research out there that suggests that there are differences in software use that do cluster by gender. And that actually software isn't developed with these differences in mind. So gender inclusiveness personas look at the differences that exist between users and how they cluster by gender, and the one, if we're looking at the research that's out there, it suggests that there are 5 dimensions that are actually worth looking into. Now, I put those 2 distributions over there to remind you what does it mean if there is a significant difference in the statistical sense. You see these distributions, and you see the difference can be very small, and especially it means that even if we talk about differences, there are many women that have higher computer self-efficacy than the average man. There are many men who have higher risk averseness than the average woman, and so on. So these are the 5 dimensions, and the reason why we think it still makes sense to look at the differences is because when you do try and consider them in developing the software gets better for everybody. Just like the famous example with the curb cuts in the sidewalks, and they don't only help people in wheelchairs, they also then help those on bicycles with trolleys and whatever people might be dragging along with them. So it does make sense to take these differences into consideration, and what the gender inclusiveness personas do is they try and integrate these into a persona description. Here you see what that looks like then. This is one of the GenderMAG personas, and the 5 dimensions that we see here in motivation and information processing and so on, they become facets of the persona, where you see the ovals. Those are those 5 dimensions, or facets we call them. And then the rest of the persona, like background, skills, job description, age, etc., that can be adjusted based on your project or on the company, whatever you have. And the goal of these personas is actually for practitioners to have a usable tool to do something with all this research that's out there on different approaches to software, and make it easy for them to be able to consider that. Margaret Burnett and her colleagues have developed this GenderMAG approach and have tested it, and actually in companies where people find like 25% of the features that they're looking at have gender inclusiveness issues. So this is something that's very helpful in magnifying. GenderMAG stands for magnifying that and helping people to do something about it. It's not just the personas, it's a kit. So it's an inspection method with a cognitive walkthrough aided by these GenderMAG personas. And what we're trying to do here is build a bridge between the research that we have and the practitioners that go around and say, yes, I would like to do something about gender inclusiveness, but how does that work? What can I actually do? Now, at the same time, of course, the GenderMAG is based on gendered personas, which raises the possibility of unintended stereotyping. Let's first of all look at what do we mean by stereotyping in social psychology. A stereotype is a thought that people adopt about a group of people. What's important and what constitutes a stereotype is you have a certain attribute on one hand. For example, I am German. We already heard the German stereotype earlier, so maybe you have other ones, I'm punctual, I'm rude, or something like that, So we carry around this pseudo-knowledge about groups of people, about people who have certain attributes, and that's the value dimension. So to have a stereotype, you have the characteristic on one hand, and then you have that associated, connected with some kind of value dimension. A stereotype will always have those two things. It can be positive, it can be negative, you can be aware of it or you cannot be aware of it. You can even find the stereotype totally silly, but it's still there. So this is something we have, and the example that we have here, for example, is that men that have the property tall are more likely to be perceived as having leadership qualities. Okay, so this leads to taller men being in higher income brackets. This is an example for an implicit stereotype, but you see it works. So the stereotype, we have this implicit link between a real difference and pseudo-knowledge. And when we're looking at this, of course, the problem isn't the real differences that are there. The problem is this baggage of pseudo-knowledge that comes around with it and the value dimension that's connotated with that. So obviously, gender is a massive source of stereotyping. We organize much of our social work through gender. So that's why we want to know, okay, if we're using these personas, how much stereotyping is going on here and what can we do about it? So the GenderMAG personas are a helpful tool for getting practitioners to focus on these attributes and the properties that are really there, but what exactly is happening in terms of the value dimension and the possibility of this pseudo-knowledge. And to find out, we used two ways to conceptualize stereotyping. One we've already heard about, the stereotype content model, and the other one is the BEM Sexrole Inventory. Let me briefly introduce them to you. Here we have already heard about the big two. And what you see here are how different social groups, now if you ask people about social groups, where they're perceived regarding these dimensions. And this is really interesting, it's really complex, and you read into it and you see, of course, that there are certain emotions already also connected with that. But what we're interested here right now is where do women and men stand, and we've already heard about this, so you already know this, that women as a group are perceived with higher worth, men are perceived with higher competence. So that was kind of the baseline then for our study. The other way we measured stereotyping is the BEM Sexrole Inventory. So Sandra BEM developed this to measure identification with gendered roles. And here the dimensions are masculinity and femininity. So this would be like the traditional value dimension connected with men, like acts like a leader, makes decisions easily, defends own beliefs, and women, in terms of is sensitive to others' needs, is gullible, is affectionate. And what she showed also with this model, and that's interesting, or that was new at the time actually, she showed that the identification with the feminine or the masculine qualities can both either be absent or be present in one individual person. So that's where the concept of somebody can be androgynous came in, or somebody can be undifferentiated. So here's a meta-analysis that was done from 2012, seeing where do men and women stand these days, which we once again used then to baseline our GenderMAG personas again. So the research question that we had was, is it possible for personas to actually encourage product designers to engage with these gender inclusiveness personas and at the same time avoid promoting gender stereotyping? We did a intercontinental study and used multiple sources and methods, 2 studies in the US and in Germany where we did the cognitive walkthroughs, the GenderMAG sessions, we did eye tracking, and we used this GenderMAG persona that you see here. That's one of them. There are several ones. This is the Abby persona, and manipulated it in the way that we either had 1 picture or 4 pictures for it. And by introducing this cast of characters, we were trying to communicate that actually what's being shown here is not just that it's this one female, but it could also be a male, it could also be an older person, and so on, and wanted to see what effect that has. So the results, I want to divide up in the results on stereotyping, and then because, of course, we said if that stops engagement, then it's not worth anything. So we also looked at the amount that people actually were engaging with these personas. The stereotype content model, we saw where the men and the women are standing. And in terms of our research, we used this as the baseline because we wanted to know, is the persona stereotyped more, just as much, or less as the social group men or as the social group women? We did not expect that it was not going to be stereotyped. So that's why we used this, this reference. And when we're looking at where does the GenderMAG persona stand here, we found that Abby here, this persona, was less warm than men, was less competent than men, was less warm than women. So in that sense, was kind of situated in between the two of them. The stereotype still, you see that closer to the female than the male, but less stereotypical than women as a group. The next one was the BEM Sexrole Inventory. Now you remember these were really the traditional values connected with gender, with men and women in terms of being masculine or feminine. And once again, we said, okay, where does the GenderMAG persona stand here? And for the Sexrole Inventory, we found that Abby was perceived as more undifferentiated than both men and women. The masculine score was lower than her feminine score, so that was still higher, but she was, as you can see here, lower both in the feminine characteristics and in the masculine characteristic, as both men and women describing themselves. So altogether, what we found here was that there's less stereotyping going on with Abby compared to how real people are stereotyped based on the stereotype content model and based on the BEM Sexrole Inventory. Now you remember we had this cast of characters where we said, okay, probably this should make a difference because our idea was there's probably a lot of stereotyping going on. Can we reduce this by showing several people? And what we saw here when we were comparing this, this version with the one picture to the one with several pictures, it was an in-between subject design, so they were either getting one or the other. We saw it made no difference. So the persona wasn't perceived more or less feminine or masculine, either presented with one or with four pictures. So that surprises, but in a way, of course, it's positive. Okay, so that was stereotyping. Now we're coming to the engagement, because we said we know that the GenderMAG personas help the design teams, and we want to know whether we're interfering with that, if we're actually changing the personas or showing these several pictures. And with the manipulation, we're trying to reduce that. And so we looked at different things here. We looked at the facet perception in terms of, okay, do the people working with that still understand what's going on there? Do they still remember the different facets and so on? And we found that they could understand it just as well. And we also looked, are they confused maybe? That was one of the things we thought maybe it confuses them to have the several pictures. That wasn't the case either. We looked at the transcript of the sessions and analyzed it for implicit and explicit turbulences and so on. So that was all very positive. We looked at the gaze. And regarding this, we saw that actually the picture didn't receive all that much attention. What you see here is that our personas were looked at very closely. The picture didn't get that much attention. And interestingly enough, neither the one nor the four pictures. So even when there was four pictures, it got just as much attention as the one picture. What did happen, and what showed us we have to be a little careful here, is that the participants spent a higher percentage of their time looking at the facets when it was just one picture. So the four pictures does seem to take away some cognitive resources there. The last result regarding the engagement here was that in the past, studies have found that people use personas, but they don't talk about them very much. So what we did here was we measured how often was the persona referred to in the GenderMAG session in these cognitive walkthroughs, and we found here that once again there were no differences between the conditions with the different pictures, but we do have an interesting result here that in 34% of the turns that were being taken, there was an invocation of the persona. So now I come to my last slide and come back to this definition of stereotypes, where we said, okay, GenderMAG personas are helpful, but we want to know how much of this pseudo-knowledge they carry around with them. And what we found here was that in terms of them being perceived as undifferentiated, there wasn't, this persona was not stereotyped that much in the first place. And what we can say is that our manipulation, so introducing this cast of different characters, didn't seem to harm the perception of the persona or anything about the process of doing this cognitive walkthrough. So the key takeaway is that participants didn't stereotype these gender inclusiveness personas as either traditionally masculine or feminine. And so you could say, yes, we can have it both ways, illustrating the personas' gender inclusiveness and at the same time avoiding stereotyping. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Do we have any questions in the audience? Why do people not look at faces in the eye tracking? Come on, people, there are so many questions. No? Okay. No questions? Let's start with that one. Why are people not looking at the face? Why do you think that? Because other eye tracking studies, people always fixate on the face first. So what's going on here? What do you think?
Yes. So that was something we looked for studies that actually analyzed or did eye tracking with personas. We didn't find any. And what we found was that if you have profiles that have pictures with them, for example, on recruiting portals or something, that recruiters spend like 20% of the time on the pictures, and we had 1/10 of that. So that is just incredible. And so the thing is that I think that the people working with the personas are at some level aware that the picture is just an illustration, and that would be the reasoning behind that.
We got time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Brooke Bribois from Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, and I've actually had the pleasure of using GenderMAG. So I was wondering, as you're going through and talking about stereotypes and then that question about the faces, just kind of a broader question about personas in general, and
Yeah.
if you think there's even much utility in having that as a persona instead of just presenting it as facets for different user types. Like, is there, like, do you need to ground it in a persona, I guess? And what you think about not doing that, or why you would argue that you need to.
We're actually trying to experiment with that in different ways. The thing is, this feeling of having an intuitive approach to a person is still something that very much talks to people. You know, so that's of course the reason of being for personas, and that's something that I don't think we can do, or I think that has a high value in itself. So I don't see us going away from that so soon.